Cops of Reddit. What is the saddest thing you've heard a criminal say? Ex-cop here. I was speaking to a juvenile in the cells who had a buttload of warrants for stealing cars and armed robberies. He told me the only way he could get toys is if he stole them, and his parents would never help him with his homework, but showed him what to say to get free McDonald's and how to avoid getting caught shoplifting. Some kids have no hope and are just going to end up in the system. Number 2. I'm in dispatch, so I don't usually hear what the suspects say, but I do hear what the victims say, especially in the moment when they're still in the heat of it. One night, the phones hit hard at about 02:30, and let me tell you, nothing good happens after 2 a.m. I take 1, reports of gunfire. Times are like that, and some people don't have constructive things to do other than pop off a few rounds. As long as there's no property damage and loss of life, everything's good, right? Then I take another, same report, add it to the pile, take down their location to help triangulate. Then I take a third, barely a whisper, and they say, nobody ever says it would be so hot. I calm her as much as I can, but shock is one hell of a drug. I manage to get her location and let my coworkers know it's go time, and loop in EMs for life-saving instructions. She was asleep in her bed and caught 3 bullets in the lower torso. I think she made it, but I'm just dispatch. I don't always get closure. Number 3. Not a cop, but a year ago, South Africa was hit by political unrest and riots. A lot of stores were looted and people were walking off with multiple TVs, appliances, etc. Some journalist was out on the streets, stopping looters and interviewing them. It's winter, it's dark, and suddenly this little kid appears holding a single bag, all alone. Couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The citizen journalist stops him and demands to see what's in the bag. He opens it up. 1 t-shirt, 1 jersey, 1 pair of pants, 1 pair of shoes, and a 3-pack of underwear. This little kid had followed a group of adults into a chaotic situation and taken what he needed, and only what he needed. I can't watch the clip without sobbing. The interviewer sent the kid off with his little bag of 1 single looted outfit. The final shot is of this tiny little thing, walking into the darkness, barefoot and alone. It was absolutely heartbreaking. Number 4. I worked in mental health, not a cop. I worked in a day program and a pre-conventional program. My clients came from institutions and were doing program as a part of their conditions of release. One of my groups ran a hot dogs cart and they profit shared after cart expenses. They made very little. They were on assistance, so it wasn't an income supplement, it was more of a perk. Anyways, I have this one woman. She had been a sex worker since she was 12. She was in her 40s. Her first week was a nightmare. She was late, struggled to cut the onions, split everything. But she showed up late each day, frantic and crying to not be fired. She worked for 1 hour each day. The following week, when she came to pick up her pay, a whole whopping $11.50, and she burst into tears. I thought it was because it was so little money. She acted as if I had given her $1,000 and an Oscar. She clutched the little envelope and cried. She said, "It's the first money I ever made not on my back. Never thought I could." We hugged and she skipped off happily. Then I sobbed in the bathroom for about 5 minutes. Number 5. Not a cop, but served as an infantryman in Afghanistan in 2011 to 2012. Was on patrol pretty much doing cop work sometimes. We'd go door to door or compound to compound, and our lieutenant would talk to locals with our translator. During one of the meetings, I was inside working as a sort of guard for my lieutenant. The guy he was talking to came up positive for gun trace residue and was a confirmed Taliban in the eye scanner thing we had. When my lieutenant questioned him before we detained him, he told my lieutenant that he didn't want to fight us, but if he didn't, the Taliban would kill his family. I was 18 to 19 and my lieutenant was 24 to 25. Now I'm 29 and I realize that war was all messed up. Number 6. I see some other mental health professionals chiming in, so I will give mine as well. I work on inpatient adolescents and children. I had this one girl who was about 16. Most actively suicidal child I've ever seen. Her parents used to sell her to drug dealers from about 2 to 3 years old. She blocked most of it out, but suffered from horrible PTSD and would wake often throughout the night in full-blown panic attacks from flashback dreams. She would literally wake up screaming, trying to strangle herself with her blanket or grabbing anything in arm's reach to stab or choke herself with. Any loud noise would send her spiraling out of control. Often, she didn't remember these episodes after she was medicated and calmed. She's the only patient I've ever had that required 2 sitters at all times, even when she was sleeping. She has serious physical, psychological, and developmental problems from the years of sexual, physical, and drug abuse that she insured from her parents and their scumbag dealers. The poor baby will never be able to live any semblance of a normal life outside of a mental hospital. Number 7. Not a cop, but while I was in a holding cell while they were running my warrants, they brought in a junkie. He was a 17-year-old kid. They asked where he was born, and he said Kyrgyzstan. Then he told them that his 14-year-old mother left him with a family member who brought him to the US. He had cysts and track marks all over his arms. When they asked him why he would do that to himself, he just deadpan looked at the officers and said, "I was dead a long time ago." The look on the cops' faces was indescribable. They both looked like something died inside of them. I sat there for 2 hours before being released. All that guy did was cry the whole time. Number 8. I worked a case where a group of lifelong friends got into an argument, resulting in the death of one of them at a birthday. I don't think it will be surprising to anyone that a lot of folks don't typically speak with law enforcement, let alone aid in an active homicide investigation. It's something I didn't fully understand at the time, but was a starting point for me. I had conversations with the best friend of the deceased and a distant relative that was an inadvertent witness. Both had negative interactions with law enforcement in the past, and it was some of the most heartbreaking work I've ever done to build rapport. Having to convince someone that you actually care about their friend that was killed and that talking about it would actually help. The whole investigation was one of the bleakest things I've ever been a part of. Just senseless violence, deserved mistrust, and a court case that was an absolute travesty. We got our man in the end, but it was fairly hollow. These men had effectively sent one of their lifelong friends to prison for killing another. The defense for the accused was one of the most incompetent proceedings I've ever been a part of, to the point that the defense was basically making a case for the prosecution in his closing remarks. There's just not a lot of feel-good stories in police work. For every baby taken out of a hot-locked car, stop leaving your kids in cars, there were 10 homicides, ODs, sexual batteries, or DOMVs we had to pick up the pieces of. Number 9. I am not a police officer, but for a time I volunteered to implement self-improvement talks within a juvenile correctional facility in Mexico. In Mexico, you are considered an adult until you are 18, so everyone inside this correctional facility is under 18. The story that most impacted me, and I still think about it from time to time, was told to me by a 16-year-old boy. He was in jail for homicide. He was a thin boy, dark-skinned, not very tall, but not very short either. Very polite. He didn't say many bad words, and his friends described him as very hardworking and very friendly. I am describing this to you so that you feel a little what I felt at that moment. He told me that his father was an alcoholic, and when he drank, he beat him and beat his brothers and sisters apart from practically sexually assaulting his mother. This situation was getting worse because it was more and more constant the days that his father arrived drunk. But the worst was when he started mixing drugs with alcohol. In his words, they were the worst moments of his life, the most violent thing I've ever seen. This story is how I remember it. It may not be 100% true, but it is how I remember him telling it to me. The question I asked him was, "How did you end up here?" And he didn't speak for a few minutes, and I saw tears fall. But after gathering courage, he told me the following. "One day, my father arrived drunk as usual and hit us as usual, but something clicked in my head when I heard the screams of my little brothers and my mom. I had to do something. So I took a knife from the kitchen and waited for him to fall asleep. I remember that I didn't have to wait long. I stood in front of him and watched him for a few seconds. I swallowed the fear, and with all my strength, I put the knife in his neck. He got up before he could stab him again, but he bled out very quickly and didn't last much longer. At that moment, everyone got up from their beds and saw what had happened, and my mom was crying and yelling at me, 'Why? Why?' But at the same time, she hugged me, and we cried together until the police arrived. My mother turned herself into the police, saying that she was the one who killed her husband, but I told them the truth and they locked us both up. But when they did the investigation, they released my mother, and that's how I ended up here. That story haunts me to this day. Sometimes reality is stranger than fiction." Number 10. I worked 20 years in corporate security. One of my responsibilities was internal theft investigations. I've literally completed thousands of investigations over the years. An investigation I completed in Baltimore was probably the saddest. The store had a missing deposit. Approximately $15,000 was gone. It never made it to the bank. The likely suspects were the 4 managers who all had access to the safe. So that was a good place to start. I talked to the first 3 and felt pretty strong that none of them were involved. The last assistant manager I needed to talk to arrived. The first thing she did was go to the bathroom and get sick. The store manager kind of laughed. She said she's been getting sick often. We're pretty sure she's pregnant, she said. I interview her, and she ends up admitting to stealing the missing deposit. She also admits to previously stealing an additional $10,000 in cash and merchandise since when she started working for us. She then talks about her drug addiction. She was always clean until about 6 months ago, when her boyfriend talked her into trying heroin. Just once, he said. A few months later, she was a complete addict. I could tell from her physical appearance she wasn't in a good place. She asked if I wanted to see something. She then showed me a few photos of just a year ago, when she was a high school cheerleader. She was very attractive, and I couldn't believe it was the same girl standing in front of me. She said she had good grades and never did any drugs at all before 6 months ago. Her boyfriend, who had got her hooked, had left her. So now she has went to the worst crime, a drug-ridden area in Baltimore, and bought the drugs on her own. She said she had another addict friend who would help look after her in such a tough area. Just seeing how she had declined physically and gotten herself in a very dark place, it was very sad to see. I told her I would agree to reduced charges and diversion as long as she was getting help. I wanted to see proof that she's gotten into rehab and some form of counseling within the next couple of months. If I came back in 2 months and she couldn't provide proof to me, she would be charged with grand theft, a felony. I was able to follow up with her once, but that was it. I wish I was confident she somehow was able to turn things around and get her life together, that this story has a happy ending, but I'm not. Number 11. I was a cop for almost 10 years in my 20s. My point of view shifted a lot during that time. There wasn't a specific thing that one person said I recall, but there was a moment that made me feel more sad than any other. I was chasing a guy who had broken into an old lady's house in his neighborhood. He seemed to get a kick out of running from us. He was young and incredibly athletic, despite addiction issues and I'm sure some other health issues, and he could get away almost every time if we didn't corner him indoors. He had punched a cop earlier in the night to get away from him, and we had him in an apartment in one of the local projects. I knew a fight was coming no matter what we did to do to de-escalate, and I was ready to scrap. Sure enough, he refused to follow any commands and tried to power through my partner and me, and we fought him. When his mother came to the hospital to check in on him, I put together that he was the same kid we'd met maybe 8 years earlier. He was around 12. His parents were hammered and high, fighting in the back patio of their apartment as they did every first weekend of the month, government checks weekend. He and his younger sister were inside watching some very rated R movie. We talked that night about how those two were absolutely not going to have a chance at fulfilling lives or happy families. I immediately felt sad and terrible for being excited and so willing to fight. I never looked at him the same. It changed the way I handled a lot of situations. Number 12. Not a cop, but I see a lot of other people chiming in. Former foster parent, Portland area. I had permanent placements and did emergency placements. I'm going to preface, I treated my foster kids like they were my blood. Still do years later. Dig deep into my post history for context if you'd like. Foster kids have it rough. The foster system is bleak for the kids and for people like me. My case manager would refuse me respite constantly, telling me I should ask my rich mommy for help. My mother isn't rich, and we are barely on speaking terms. The emergency places, EPs, were tough. If you are unfamiliar with that, it's immediate, temporary placement for kids recently removed from their homes, sometimes removed from other foster homes. Before you take the EP, the caseworker involved would often speak to you, briefly explain the situation, ask if you were comfortable and able to handle the kids. Sometimes they'd email you a little dossier. They were never accurate, omitted a lot of important details too. I never turned a kid down though, no matter what. From babies to teenagers, I did what I could. Meth babies were the hardest emotionally. One particular placement still gets me. I got a call one weekend from an EP. Foster mom felt threatened by the kid's hostile behavior. He had RAD, reactive attachment disorder, and blew up on her. He ended up in a hospital near me, and she refused to take him back. Caseworkers tell me they'll organize medical transport and to sit tight until he arrives. It's 4 p.m., so I order pizza. 6 p.m., still no kid. I call the caseworker. She's gone for the day. I speak to her supervisor, who pulls up the file. No medical transport has been requested. I offer to go just get the kid. The hospital is close. She refuses and cites some arbitrary guidelines. Supervisor tells me she'll arrange it, but I get her number just in case. 10 p.m., still nothing. I finally get a hold of the supervisor again after hours of calling, who tells me they forgot. They'll get right on it though. BS. So I offer to go pick up the kid again, or I'll complain to her boss about the mess. She relents. I call the hospital to confirm with them, make sure everything's good, and go. The kid's decent, 13 years old, almost as tall as me, strong build but sweet, very polite. As we're leaving, a nurse stops me though. "You can't forget his medicine." She said he'll die without it. At no point did anyone mention this to me. Years later, and this still infuriates me. If not for that nurse, I wouldn't have known, and I would have had a huge medical emergency on my hands. Fast forward a bit, because this is becoming a novel. The night goes well. Kid's super well, behaved, no issues. The next morning, we have breakfast, and he stops talking to the other kids and looks at me. He asks how long he's staying. I tell him I don't know, because it's true. EPs can last days, weeks, months. They are usually abruptly placed in new homes. There's no set time frame. I could tell that upset him though. He stood up and said, "Okay, I'm going to leave then." So, big thing about foster care and especially EPs, you can't let them wander off. If you can, restrain them. Butterfly hold as an example, but we were told in extreme cases to sit on the kids, hand to God. If you couldn't restrain them, you called the caseworker or the police. I ended up putting him in a butterfly hold and had one of the kids speed dial the caseworker for me, the caseworker who simply called the police. He started sobbing and talking. We ended up sitting on my couch talking until the police arrived. Out of my control at that point. This poor kid just wanted someone, anyone, to give enough of a damn about him to stick around. But no one ever did. He blamed himself and said he knew he was worthless. He asked me why nobody was capable of loving him, and he asked me if it was because he was black. As they were loading him up into an ambulance, totally unnecessary, but this was the caseworker's call at this point, he begged me to stay in touch. I told him I would, and he was welcome back anytime. I did try. I tried constantly, emailing or calling his caseworker, but it was always someone new. They said it was inappropriate or it would not be good for his mental health. So despite my best efforts, I became yet another person who let him down, lied to him, and abandoned him. I know the chances of him ever seeing this are non-existent, but I'm sorry, little dude. I'm really, really sorry.